The millionaire sees the waitress arguing with his son and gets angry. However, when the truth is revealed, he takes an action that leaves everyone speechless. Charleston, South Carolina, with its cobblestone streets and pastel-colored houses, glowed under the soft warmth of the spring sun. At a small family-owned restaurant tucked away from the busier downtown squares, the scent of fried okra and freshly baked cornbread filled the air. Locals gathered at their usual tables, sharing laughter and iced tea, while ceiling fans turned lazily above. It was the kind of place where people came not just for the food, but for the comfort of routine. Thomas Whitaker sat at a corner booth with his 8-year-old son, Luke. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and khakis, he looked like any other middle-aged father, taking time off to enjoy lunch with his child. Nobody in the restaurant seemed to recognize him, not the couple seated by the window, nor the older man reading a newspaper by the counter. And that was how Thomas liked it. Despite being one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in South Carolina, he valued these rare moments of anonymity more than the millions tucked away in investment portfolios and luxury estates. He was a man of deliberate silence, one who built his empire with precision and a calm, calculating demeanor. But around Luke, a softness emerged. The boy, with sandy blonde hair and bright blue eyes, was talkative and curious, often bouncing in his seat and peppering his father with questions. Thomas, though quiet, answered each one with patience. Their meal had just arrived, macaroni and cheese for Luke and grilled salmon for Thomas, when a shift in the room's energy interrupted the peace. The restaurant door chimed, signaling a new arrival, but Thomas barely looked up. It wasn't until a waitress appeared near their table, her voice slightly raised and her expression tight, that something felt off. The waitress, in her mid-30s, wore a simple uniform of black slacks and a forest green blouse, embroidered with the restaurant's name, Hattie's Table. Her name tag read Emily. She had dark circles under her eyes and strands of hair that had escaped her ponytail. There was an intensity in her gaze, something that didn't belong in a place like this. She stood in front of their table, eyes fixed on Luke, who had gone unusually quiet. "Young man," she said, her tone clipped, "we need to talk about what you just did." Thomas furrowed his brow, setting down his fork. "Excuse me?" he asked, not quite sure he'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, sir, but your son was at the counter when I stepped away. He had no business going through my things." Luke looked down, chewing his lip. "Is this some kind of joke?" Thomas asked, his voice low but firm. The surrounding chatter in the restaurant began to die down. Several patrons turned their heads toward the scene. "You're confronting a child?" Emily didn't flinch. "He needed to hear it," she said simply. Silence fell around them like a curtain. The tension thickened. A few tables away, a fork clinked loudly against a plate, the only sound that broke the uneasy quiet. Thomas stood up, towering over Emily. His voice grew colder. "If you have a problem, you bring it to me, not to my son." Emily's eyes didn't leave Luke. "Then maybe you should ask him what he was doing behind the counter." The words hung there, heavy and unsettling. Luke shifted in his seat, his small hands curling into fists on his lap. For a moment, Thomas didn't know what to say. He looked down at his son, then back at Emily. Everything about this felt wrong, inappropriate, offensive. But there was something else too. A tremble in Emily's jaw, a tightness in her throat. She wasn't angry. She was hurt. Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the restaurant manager rushed over, attempting to defuse the situation. "Emily, is everything all right?" the manager asked, glancing nervously at Thomas, then at the curious diners who now watched openly. Emily took a breath, blinked hard. He was at the counter. My things were moved. I reacted." Luke, barely audible, whispered, "I'm sorry." Thomas turned sharply. "What was that?" The boy looked up, eyes glistening. "I touched her bag. I didn't mean to, but I saw something." Thomas's heart sank. The scene shifted again, the confusion in his mind giving way to a different kind of tension, one laced with guilt and concern. He looked at Emily once more, but her face had already started to change. The anger was gone. She looked as though she might cry. Before another word could be said, the manager motioned toward the back. "Let's handle this calmly. Maybe we should look at the cameras. Emily nodded immediately. Thomas hesitated, then gave a small nod of agreement. All at once, the restaurant began to buzz again, patrons returning to their meals, though some kept glancing toward the booth where a millionaire sat in quiet turmoil, unsure of what had just unraveled, and even more unsure of what was about to be revealed. Thomas Whitaker had faced courtroom battles worth millions and negotiated with world leaders without blinking an eye, but at that moment, standing in the middle of a modest Charleston restaurant, watching a waitress scold his 8-year-old son, his control wavered. His instinct wasn't refined business diplomacy. It was pure paternal instinct. His gaze locked on Emily, and something in his posture changed. He no longer looked like a customer. He looked like a man with power, offended and ready to act. The din of cutlery and conversation around them was slowly returning, but the moment had already left its mark. Patrons pretended not to listen, their eyes flickering in curiosity and subtle judgment. A mother at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably in her seat, pulling her own child closer. The atmosphere inside Hattie's table had turned heavy, and it was clear the drama at the corner booth had everyone's attention. Thomas leaned down slightly toward Luke, whose face was tilted downward, cheeks flushed. The boy looked not at his father, but at the table, where his untouched macaroni and cheese had started to cool. "Is what she said true?" Thomas asked, voice low yet carrying the weight of expectation. He wasn't angry with Luke yet, just confused, searching for something that made sense. Luke didn't answer right away. His throat moved in a dry swallow. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I just saw a picture. I wanted to look." Thomas exhaled through his nose, standing upright again. His eyes snapped back to Emily. "He's a child. He doesn't understand boundaries the way we do. If something was taken or broken, I will take responsibility. But raising your voice like that in front of a room full of strangers, that was unnecessary." Emily's arms were stiff at her sides. "He didn't just look," she said, her voice steadier now, though her breath still caught at the edges. "He went through my bag. That's not curiosity, Mr. Whoever you are. That's intrusion." Thomas narrowed his eyes, considering whether or not to reveal who he was. It wasn't pride that drove the impulse. It was something else. Perhaps the idea that if she knew, she might approach this situation differently. But he said nothing. Instead, he reached for his wallet, pulling out a sleek black card and holding it out. "If there's any damage, please have the manager. Send me the bill." But Emily didn't even glance at the card. Her eyes, wet but still steady, were fixed on Luke. "That picture," she said quietly, "was the only one I had left of my daughter." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. There was something behind her exhaustion, behind the frustration in her voice, a weight and unspoken sorrow that now crept into the open air. She wasn't reacting to a child being mischievous. She was reacting to a piece of her world being touched without permission. Still, Thomas couldn't let go of what had just happened. His son had been scolded in public. People were watching. And even if Luke had made a mistake, there was a line that Emily had crossed by addressing it the way she did. He straightened his shoulders. "This isn't how professionals handle conflict," he said calmly but with steel in his tone. "If your personal items were touched, you come to the parent. You don't confront an 8-year-old. Emily flinched, slightly, her mouth opening as if to respond, but then closing again. The manager stepped forward, interjecting with more force this time. "Let's step into the back, both of you, just to clear things up." Thomas hesitated. He didn't want to make a scene, not more than they already had. But Luke sat motionless, and his eyes now shimmered with unshed tears. This wasn't about pride anymore. He needed answers. He gave a small nod. "Fine." They followed the manager through the swinging kitchen doors into the back office, a cramped space with a desk, an old filing cabinet, and a flickering fluorescent light that gave everything a slight green hue. The atmosphere shifted the moment. The doors closed behind them. It felt quieter here, more honest. Emily stood with her arms crossed, still visibly tense. Thomas stood beside Luke, who lingered near the doorway, his hands buried deep into the pockets of his shorts. The manager went straight to the security system and began rewinding the footage from the restaurant floor. They stood in silence for a moment as the black and white video played. Thomas watched the screen, his eyes narrowing as he saw a small figure move from the booth, approach the counter and lean over. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. Luke stood on tiptoes, looked around, then reached toward the lower shelf beneath the register where Emily had stored her bag. It happened in seconds. Luke reached inside, fished something out, something small and rectangular, and stared at it. Then, as if realizing he might get caught, he quickly returned it to the bag and scurried back to the booth. Emily spoke softly. "He didn't steal it, I never said he did. But that photo, I don't have a backup. It's not on a phone, it's not saved anywhere. It's the only copy I have left." Thomas didn't reply. He just watched the footage, again as the manager replayed it. There was something deeply unsettling about watching his son act in secrecy, even if it had been innocent. He had never thought of Luke as the kind of child to snoop or disrespect someone's privacy. But there it was, undeniable on the screen. Luke mumbled, "She looked like someone from a storybook. I wanted to see her better." Thomas glanced down. "Who?" he asked. "The girl in the photo," Luke said. "She was wearing a yellow dress." She was smiling like she was flying. Emily turned her head sharply. "I remember that." Luke nodded slowly. Emily pressed a hand over her mouth, then lowered it. "That's the dress she wore the day we went to the fair. She made me take a picture because she felt like a butterfly." Something shifted in Thomas's chest. He felt the ground beneath his conviction begin to tremble. The image painted by Luke and the memory it evoked in Emily were painfully real. And the fear she must have felt, thinking for even a moment that the last trace of that memory might be lost, suddenly felt entirely justified. For a long second, none of them spoke. Then Thomas cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, turning to Emily. "I reacted before I understood. That was wrong." Emily didn't look smug or satisfied. She just nodded, quietly. "I didn't mean to scare him. I just panicked. It felt like something was slipping through my fingers all over again." Thomas turned to Luke. "Do you understand now why it mattered so much?" Luke nodded. "I want you to say it," Thomas said. "I'm sorry," Luke said, his voice cracking. "I shouldn't have touched your bag." Emily's eyes shimmered again, but she nodded. "Thank you." The manager, sensing the weight of the moment, said nothing. He simply walked out, giving him space. Thomas didn't speak again until they returned to the dining room. The food was cold, the moment had passed, but something far more important had just begun. And though the restaurant resumed its rhythm, Thomas knew nothing would taste the same anymore. Not the salmon, not the iced tea, not even the air he breathed. Because beneath the simple surface of a quiet lunch had surfaced a sorrow deeper than wealth could measure, and a truth about his own child he could no longer ignore. The car ride home was unusually quiet. Luke stared out the window, the Charleston streets passing by in a blur of pastel houses and blooming crepe myrtles, his hands resting in his lap as though they no longer belonged to him. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were miles away. The image of the waitress, Emily, struggling to hold back tears as she spoke about her daughter, haunted him. For all his business acumen, Thomas had not expected to feel so disarmed by a moment that, hours earlier, he might have dismissed as insignificant. He had planned a simple lunch with his son, a chance to reconnect after several long weeks of work obligations that kept him traveling between cities, but nothing about the afternoon had unfolded simply. And now, with every mile that took them away from the restaurant, Thomas replayed the encounter like a tape on loop. The stern tone of Emily's voice, the flicker of fear in Luke's eyes, and the devastating phrase, "The only photo I have left," echoed with a gravity that settled deep within him. At a red light, Thomas finally spoke. "Why did you go into her bag, Luke?" The boy's shoulders lifted slightly as if he wanted to disappear into the car seat. "I didn't mean to make her sad," he said. I saw the picture sticking out. It was almost falling. I thought it was pretty." Thomas considered this. Luke had always been curious, gentle. He'd never shown signs of mischief or ill intent. But curiosity, even innocent, could still lead to pain. Thomas knew that now, and so did Luke. "She thought she lost it," Thomas said quietly. "That's why she was so upset." "I didn't know," Luke whispered, his voice barely above the hum of the engine. "I know," Thomas replied. "But you need to understand something, son. That photo wasn't just a picture. It was the last thing she had of someone she loved." Luke nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his knees. "I saw the dress she was wearing. It was yellow, and she was laughing. It looked like a happy picture." Thomas looked over for a moment, taken aback by how clearly Luke remembered the image. He wondered if, in some unspoken way, the boy had connected with it, had felt something Emily carried in her heart, even for just a second. It was a small comfort in a situation that had spiraled so quickly, and yet it wasn't enough. By the time they reached home, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a soft orange light over their front yard. Their house, a sprawling southern-style home with white columns and a wraparound porch, stood silent. Luke stepped out of the car and waited by the front steps as Thomas gathered his thoughts before joining him. Inside, the usual rhythm returned. Luke went to his room without needing to be told. Thomas removed his shoes by the door, loosened his collar and walked to his study. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at the family photos on the wall. There were dozens. Pictures of vacations, birthday parties, Luke's first day of school, and as he looked at them, he understood Emily's pain with sudden, startling clarity. To lose a child was unfathomable, but to lose the last tangible reminder of them, something as small as a photograph, was a cruelty that most would never comprehend. He stood there, unmoving, for what felt like a long time. Then he went upstairs and knocked on Luke's door. "Can I come in?" he asked. Luke, lying on his bed, nodded. The room was dim, the soft glow of a nightlight casting shadows on the walls. Thomas sat beside him, the mattress dipping under his weight. "Do you remember when your mother passed away?" he asked gently. Luke turned toward him, nodding again. His voice was quiet. "I was 5. How you remember how we kept that necklace she wore every day, the one with the little green stone?" Luke's eyes lit up faintly. "Yeah, you said it was special." "It was," Thomas said, "because it reminded me of her. It was something I could touch when I missed her. Imagine if someone took it, even just to look at it without asking. How would that make you feel?" Luke's mouth tightened. "I wouldn't like that." Thomas nodded. "That's what happened to Emily today. You didn't mean to hurt her, but you touched something sacred." Luke's eyes welled up again. "I didn't think it was that big." "Sometimes," Thomas said, "the smallest things are the most important." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was thoughtful. Thomas stood and kissed his son's forehead. "Get some rest." That night, Thomas barely slept. He found himself on his laptop, reading articles about grief and loss, scrolling through forums where parents poured out their hearts over lost children, and he kept returning to the same thought. What if that had been him? What if the necklace he kept in a drawer had been the last piece of someone he loved, and it was lost even briefly? Would he have handled it with grace? Or would he have panicked just like Emily? The next morning the household woke early. The sun filtered in through the curtains, golden and gentle. Luke came downstairs already dressed, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand. Thomas looked up from his coffee, raising an eyebrow. "I made something," Luke said, walking over. Thomas took the paper and opened it. It was a drawing, a girl in a yellow dress flying like a butterfly. The lines were childlike but sincere. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "I'm sorry." She looked happy. "I didn't mean to be bad." Thomas's throat tightened. He cleared it. "This is beautiful, Luke." "I want to give it to her," Luke said. And Thomas knew, without a doubt, that they had to return to the restaurant, not just to apologize properly, but to acknowledge the kind of healing that couldn't happen through silence. Because sometimes, the only way to fix what's broken is to face it head-on, with honesty, with humility, and with the willingness to understand someone else's pain. The drawing, that simple act of kindness, was the beginning of something neither of them yet understood, and as Thomas placed it carefully into an envelope, he realized that his son had already taken the first step toward making things right. The next day began with a different kind of energy, subdued, weighted by reflection. Thomas had made many decisions in his life, most of them swift based on instinct or logic, but this time his next move came from a place deeper than reason. As he stood by the window of his home office, watching the morning light spill over, the lawn he knew returning to the restaurant wasn't just about smoothing over a misunderstanding. It was about something more vital, teaching his son what it meant to take responsibility and offering a woman the dignity she deserved after an emotional rupture. Luke, carrying the envelope with his drawing and apology note inside, was quiet, but focused. There was no hesitation in him now. The previous day's confusion and embarrassment had transformed into something more mature, something sincere. He hadn't spoken much during breakfast, but Thomas could see the determination in his eyes. It was the look of a boy who had begun to grasp that his actions, no matter how small, carried weight in the world around him. When they arrived at the restaurant, Hattie's table had only just opened for the lunch crowd. The hostess recognized them instantly, a flicker of discomfort passing through her eyes before she forced a polite smile. Thomas gave her a nod and asked quietly if Emily was working today. She excused herself and disappeared into the back. Minutes later, Emily emerged from the kitchen, apron tied loosely at her waist, her hair pulled back, eyes a little redder than the day before but steady. She approached with a caution that was understandable. She hadn't forgotten what happened, nor had she expected to see them again. Thomas stood. "We came to speak with you," he said. Emily glanced at Luke, then back at Thomas. "You don't need to. Yesterday was a lot. I don't want to make it harder." But Luke stepped forward before Thomas could respond. He held out the envelope with both hands, arms slightly trembling. "I'm sorry," he said. "I drew her, from the picture." Emily looked down at the envelope, hesitating. Then she took it and slowly opened it. She unfolded the drawing, and her eyes locked on the image. The yellow dress, the open arms, the small smile Luke had done his best to capture. Her breath caught, and for a moment, she said nothing. "I didn't mean to make you sad," Luke added, his voice smaller now. "I just thought she looked like she was having a fun day." Emily's hands clutching the drawing trembled slightly. She sat down in the empty chair across from them, the paper resting on the table between them now. "She was," she said, voice low but steady. "That day was her favorite. We had cotton candy. She made me go on the Ferris wheel even though I'm terrified of heights." Thomas sat again, unsure if he should say anything. But Emily spoke before he had to. "I don't blame him," she said. "I really don't. It was just, when I saw him with the photo, I panicked. My heart stopped. That picture, it's not just a memory, it's my proof she existed." Thomas nodded. "I understand. And I'm sorry for not seeing that right away." Emily looked at Luke. "You remembered her dress," she said softly. Luke nodded. It was bright, like sunshine. For the first time since they met, Emily smiled, not fully but enough to show something had shifted. She folded the drawing and placed it inside her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said, looking at Luke with eyes that now held gentleness. "This means more than you know." The manager approached their table, having observed the interaction from a distance. "I can show you the footage again if you'd like," he offered, looking at Thomas, who was about to decline when Emily nodded. "I think it's important," she said, "for closure, for honesty." Thomas agreed. They walked again to the back office, the same cramped space where truths had unraveled just the day before. The manager rewound the footage, pulling up the exact timestamp. The black and white image appeared again, showing the moment Luke rose from the booth and wandered toward the counter. They watched as he leaned forward, hesitated, and then gently opened Emily's bag, pulling out the photograph and staring at it. Emily was standing beside Thomas, arms crossed, but her expression was no longer tight with anger. She was watching with the eyes of someone who wanted to understand the child's intent rather than punish him for it. They watched as Luke, still, visible on the grainy screen, looked toward the kitchen to make sure no one was watching, then handled the photograph with surprising care before returning it and scampering back to the booth. The manager looked at Emily. "He didn't damage anything." "I know," she replied. "I didn't think he did." Thomas observed Emily as she spoke, the calm in her voice, the resolution she had clearly come to. He felt something shift inside him again, not guilt this time, but admiration. She had been through something most could not imagine, and yet carried herself with a grounded strength that reminded him of a different kind of resilience. Not the kind that builds empires, but the kind that rebuilds people. As they left the office and stepped back into the dining room, Thomas paused. "I want to make this right," he said to Emily. "Not just for today, but beyond." Emily looked confused. "What do you mean?" Thomas reached into his pocket and handed her a card. Not a credit card this time, but a business card. His name, title, and contact details were printed on fine matte stock. "I run a foundation. It supports families who've been through loss, trauma. We offer more than financial help. We create programs led by people who've lived through it, people who understand." Emily looked down at the card, then back up at him. "Why me?" "Because the way you handled all of this, the honesty, the way you spoke to Luke, the way you held yourself despite your pain, it takes a kind of strength that can't be taught. And that's exactly the kind of person who should be helping others." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not sure I'm qualified." "You lived through the worst thing imaginable and found your way back to a life that still helps others. That's qualification enough." Emily didn't answer right away. She turned the card in her hand a few times, studying it as though trying to decide whether or not it was real. Thomas didn't pressure her. He simply gave her a respectful nod. "The offer stands. If you want to talk, my number's there." And with that, he placed a hand gently on Luke's shoulder and walked toward the exit. As they stepped outside, the midday sun warming their backs, Thomas glanced down at his son. "You did something good today." Luke looked up. "Will she be okay now?" Thomas paused, considering the question. "Maybe not right away," he said. "But you helped. And sometimes that's the first step." Inside, Emily stood still, holding the card and the drawing in her hands. The envelope rested on the counter, a quiet reminder of what had happened and what might still come. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think of her daughter not as a loss, but as a light that, through unexpected kindness, might illuminate the lives of others. Later that afternoon, long after the restaurant had quieted down and the last of the lunch crowd had trickled out, Emily sat alone in the staff lounge, her fingers gently tracing the edges of Luke's drawing. The paper had started to curl slightly at the corners, and the childlike strokes of yellow, sky blue, and light brown stood out against the dull grey of the table. She had read the note attached to it at least 10 times. Each word, written in a wobbly hand, carried a sincerity that pierced through the fatigue she carried every day like an invisible coat. She had never imagined a moment like that would unfold. Not with a stranger, and certainly not with the child of a man who could have just as easily crushed her with a few well-placed phone calls. But Thomas hadn't done that. Instead, he'd returned, with humility, with respect, and with an offer she still hadn't fully processed. The staff lounge was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional murmur of voices drifting from the kitchen. Emily closed her eyes, resting her forehead against her hand. It had been over 2 years since Lucy's death, but grief had never left. It had simply evolved, becoming quieter, deeper, more permanent, like a second heartbeat that no one could hear but her. The door creaked open, and the restaurant manager stepped in. He was a kind man in his 50s, with a weary but steady demeanor. He looked at her with the hesitance of someone unsure whether to intrude or offer support. "Emily," he said softly, "I thought you might want to see something." She sat up straighter. "What is it?" He walked over to the small desk in the corner and placed something carefully on the surface. It was a printed still from the security footage, a black and white freeze frame showing Luke at the counter, just as he reached into her bag. But it wasn't the act that stood out. It was the expression on his face. In the photo, Luke wasn't grinning or mischievous. His small face was completely still, eyes wide with wonder, almost reverent. It wasn't the look of a boy trying to cause trouble. It was the look of a child discovering something precious, something that stirred awe instead of amusement. "I paused it here because I thought you'd want to remember this part," Not the rest of it, the manager said. Emily stared at the image. Her throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and stepped out, leaving her once again in silence. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas sat at his desk, his phone resting in his hand, screen lit with Emily's contact information. He had entered it that morning after they left the restaurant. He hadn't called, not yet. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps part of him wanted to give her space. Or perhaps part of him wasn't ready to admit how deeply the situation had affected him. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. His thoughts drifted to the foundation he had started 5 years ago. Originally, it had been a tax strategy, a way to shift excess profits towards something palatable to the public. But over time, the mission had grown more real to him, especially after his wife died. Supporting families through trauma had become less of a business move and more of a personal calling. Still, they lacked someone like Emily, someone who had walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but intact enough to reach for others who were still burning. That kind of strength couldn't be bought or trained. It had to be lived. The phone rang. Thomas glanced at the caller ID. It was the restaurant. He answered immediately. "Mr. Whitaker?" It was the manager. "Yes," Thomas replied, sitting up. "I thought you'd want to know. Emily stayed late. She's been sitting with the drawing. I think your son did something remarkable." Thomas didn't speak for a moment. Then, "Thank you for telling me." He hung up and leaned back again, the faintest smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Maybe Luke had understood something even Thomas hadn't. Maybe he had seen in that tiny photograph something that couldn't be captured by business plans or boardroom logic. A glimpse into a life, a bond, a loss. And maybe, in his own innocent way, he had begun to build a bridge that adults would never have known how to construct. That evening, as twilight descended over Charleston, Thomas decided to visit his foundation's main office. The building sat quietly by the riverside, a modest yet elegant structure with large windows and walls lined with photographs of community outreach events, smiling families, and framed letters from those they had helped. He walked through the halls alone, stopping in front of a glass display where they kept mementos from past beneficiaries, small things like hand-knitted scarves, child's paintings, a single soccer ball signed by a boy who had lost both parents in a car crash and later became a youth counselor through the foundation. In that moment, Thomas knew Emily's drawing belonged there, not because it was art, but because it was proof that healing didn't always begin in hospitals or support groups. Sometimes it started at a lunch table between a grieving mother and a boy who didn't yet understand the full weight of his actions. At that very same hour, Emily sat in her modest apartment, the drawing now framed, placed gently on the small table beneath her window. She had made tea, a ritual she hadn't kept since Lucy died, and stared at the steam rising from the cup. She hadn't made a decision yet about the job offer. Part of her feared stepping into a world so different from waitressing, so exposed, so deeply tied to the rawness of her own experience. What if she failed? What if the pain was too close, too constant? But another part, quiet, hopeful, wondered if maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something she had never imagined for herself. A chance not to forget, but to build from the memory. She reached into her pocket, unfolded the business card again, and stared at the embossed letters. She didn't dial the number, not yet. But for the first time she didn't look away. And somewhere across town in the soft quiet of his room, Luke slept with one hand curled near his pillow and a faint smile on his lips. In his dreams, a girl in a yellow dress ran barefoot through fields of sunlight, her laughter carried on the wind. Before the accident, Emily Carrington had been someone else entirely, not in the way people sometimes say they've changed, but in a deeply cellular way. She had been bright, fast-talking, the kind of woman who organized fundraisers at Lucy's school and still managed to make it to every parent-teacher conference, no matter how long her shifts were. Her world was small, perhaps, but full, centered, around the soft rhythm of bedtime stories, Saturday pancakes, and walks through the park where Lucy would chase ducks until her cheeks flushed red with laughter. Her husband had left when Lucy was just a toddler. He said he wasn't ready for a life tethered to the needs of someone else, least of all a child. Emily didn't ask him to stay. She picked up extra shifts, cut corners, and made it work. What? She couldn't give Lucien money. She made up for with time and love and a fierce sense of protection. They had lived in a small apartment above a bakery, where the scent of cinnamon rolls lingered through the vents. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. Every evening, after closing her last shift, Emily would climb the stairs to find Lucy, waiting with stories about school and half-finished art projects, clutched in tiny hands. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in March. Emily had picked Lucy up early from school. The girl had been feeling a little under the weather, and Emily, already worried, didn't want to risk it worsening. She remembered how Lucy leaned her head against the car window on the drive home, watching the raindrops race each other, her small voice asking if they could still make pancakes for dinner. They never made it back. A delivery truck had lost control at an intersection less than 3 blocks from their home. It came from nowhere, skidding on the slick pavement and crashing into the side of their car. Emily would later be told that Lucy died on impact. She never saw it. She only remembered the sound of metal tearing, the blinding flash, and the unbearable silence that followed. In the weeks that came after, Emily moved through time like a ghost. She attended the funeral, nodded at condolences, but the world no longer made sense. The colors dulled, the noises dimmed. She returned to work far earlier than anyone expected, not because she was ready, but because she couldn't bear the stillness of home. The apartment above the bakery now echoed with absence. Lucy's drawings remained on the fridge. Her toys still lined the shelves, but without her presence, they became relics instead of reminders. People tried to help. Friends offered company. Her manager gave her time off. Even distant family members reached out. But grief had made her insular. She stopped answering calls. She declined invitations. The only thing that kept her grounded was the photograph, one single image taken a few weeks before Lucy's death, on the day of the town fair. Lucy had worn a yellow dress that day, a shade so bright it almost hurt to look at it. She had insisted on getting her face painted like a tiger, and had laughed the entire time Emily tried to clean the smudges off. A stranger had offered to take their picture near the Ferris wheel, and for once Emily had said yes. She hated photos of herself, but Lucy looked radiant, arms spread wide, hair messy from the wind, joy bursting from her like sunlight through leaves. That photograph, printed at a drugstore kiosk the next morning, had lived in Emily's wallet ever since. After the accident, it became something else entirely, a final tether to a life that no longer existed. Over time, Emily moved out, left the apartment. It became too unbearable, too filled with ghosts. She found a small place across town and took a job at Hattie's Table, a quiet restaurant, where the regulars came for pot roast and peach cobbler. It was safe, uneventful. The tips weren't great, but she wasn't looking for excitement anymore. She needed routine. She needed to survive the hours between sleep and daylight. She never talked about Lucy, not with co-workers, not with customers. Grief, she had learned, made people uncomfortable. They didn't know what to say. They fumbled, tried to pivot the conversation, and offered hollow condolences that made the air between them feel like glass. So she kept Lucy hidden, preserved in silence, and in the photograph she checked every day to make sure was still there. Then Luke had found it. When she saw the boy with the photo in his hand, everything inside her collapsed. It was an instinctive fear, a burst of adrenaline and rage not directed at him but at the universe that kept trying to take more from her. She hadn't known who he was. She hadn't cared. All she saw was a stranger touching the only piece of her daughter she had left. She hadn't meant to scare him. She hadn't meant to raise her voice. But something in her snapped. Later, when she saw the drawing, when she heard the boy's apology, something broke open, not in a destructive way, but in a way that let light in for the first time in years. That night, she sat on the floor of her living room with a shoebox of Lucy's things. She hadn't opened it in over a year. Inside were birthday cards, a ballet slipper, a plastic bracelet with rainbow beads, and a half-used notebook filled with scribbles and stickers. She added Luke's drawing to the box, tucking it beside a folded paper crown Lucy had made in preschool. The next morning, Emily stood at her window, holding Thomas's card. The logo of the foundation was small and elegant, embossed in silver. ink. She flipped it over, rereading the handwritten note Thomas had added beneath his contact number. When you're ready. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't pressure. It was a door left ajar. She placed the card on the table and got dressed. For work. At the restaurant, everything felt the same, but something inside her had shifted. The usual customers arrived, smiling their greetings, unaware that anything about Emily had changed. But she moved differently now, not with ease, but with intention. When she refilled coffee cups, she listened more closely. When she took orders, she made eye contact. A small part of her had reawakened, the part that used to care deeply, the part that loved freely before grief stole her joy and locked it away. In the kitchen during her break, she picked up her phone and typed a message to the number on the card. She stared at it for a long time before hitting send. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, but I'd like to talk. No signature, no explanation, just an honest admission of uncertainty. She didn't expect a reply right away, and she didn't get one. But something in her had already begun to shift, because sometimes the first step toward healing isn't a grand gesture. It's a whisper in the dark, a quiet willingness to believe that maybe, just maybe, there's more waiting on the other side of sorrow. The message came late in the afternoon, just as the last board meeting of the day ended, and Thomas found himself alone in the glass-walled conference room of his downtown office. The sun was low on the horizon, casting golden streaks across the polished table and throwing long shadows against the floor. He had been reviewing documents half-heartedly, distracted by thoughts that refused to be silenced, no matter how many numbers he sifted through. When his phone buzzed and lit up with a number he didn't recognize, he almost ignored it. But something, instinct, maybe, or hope, made him check. The message was short. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do, but I'd like to talk. No signature, no context, but Thomas knew exactly who it was. He stared at the screen for a long moment, heart heavier than he expected. This wasn't business. This wasn't one of the neat, predictable problems he was so good at solving. This was grief, raw and uneven, reaching across the silence. And for once, he didn't try to control it. He simply responded, "Tomorrow at noon, my office, no expectations, just a conversation." He sent the address. And then he sat back and breathed for the first time in what felt like hours. That evening, over dinner, he watched Luke more closely than usual. The boy was talking about a class project, gesturing animatedly with his fork, laughing at his own jokes. There was something new in him, a sense of awareness that hadn't been there before. Thomas recognized it because he had seen it in others who had faced something real for the first time. And Luke had. In his own way, he had touched something, sacred, and come out the other side changed. After they cleared the table, Thomas knelt beside him in the living room and asked, "Do you remember what we talked about? About how sometimes the smallest things mean the most?" Luke nodded, watching his father curiously. "Well, you helped someone remember that, and now she's going to talk to me about her story, about what comes next. Will she be okay now?" Luke asked. "I think she's trying to be," Thomas said, "and that's a big step." The next morning was quiet. Thomas arrived at his office early, asked his assistant to hold all calls, and cleared his afternoon schedule. For the first time in a long while, he didn't care about the investors waiting on reports or the emails piling up in his inbox. Something more important was about to happen. Emily arrived a few minutes before noon. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back, face bare of makeup. She looked tired but present, like someone who had decided after a long time to stop hiding from the world. Thomas stood as she entered, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I almost didn't," Emily replied, her voice calm but guarded. "I wasn't sure what I'd say." "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to," he said. "This isn't an interview. It's just a chance to talk." She nodded slowly and sat down, her hands clasped in her lap. There was a pause long enough to feel the weight of all that had led to this moment. Then Emily exhaled and began to speak, not about qualifications or resumes, but about her daughter, about the fair, the accident, the silence that followed, about working at Hattie's table not because she needed the money, but because it was the only place that didn't demand more than she could give. Thomas listened. Not the way executives pretend to listen, nodding while planning their next words, but truly listened. Every word she spoke carved a deeper understanding into him. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't even looking for purpose. She was just trying to find solid ground again. When she finished, Thomas leaned forward. "You have something this foundation needs," he said. "You speak from a place none of us can reach. That pain, that honesty, it could change people's lives." Emily looked down at her hands. "I'm afraid I'll break." "You already broke," he said gently. "And you're still here. That's what makes you the strongest person in the room." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "What would I even do?" "Whatever you're ready for," he replied. "So you'd work with people who've lost what can't be replaced. You'd help them find a way to live with it, maybe even through it. There's no script. We make space for the real story." She was quiet again. Then, to his surprise, she laughed, a soft, incredulous sound. "I served you mashed potatoes 3 days ago. Now you want me to help run your foundation?" "I didn't see you then," Thomas admitted. "Not really, but I see you now." Emily's eyes met his. "I don't want pity." "This isn't pity," Thomas said. "It's recognition." Outside, the city moved on, cars and people and phones ringing in distant offices. But inside that room, something shifted. It wasn't a contract or a deal. It wasn't even a formal decision. It was something quieter and far more significant. A meeting between pain and purpose, uncertainty and the courage to step forward anyway. Emily stood. "I'll think about it." Thomas nodded. "Take your time." As she left, Thomas didn't try to follow or convince her. He watched her walk out of his office and into the daylight, shoulders squared, head high. She hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. And sometimes that was enough to know a new beginning had already started. The weekend brought with it a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the Whittaker household. The weather was cool, the kind of grey sky calm that settled over Charleston with a quietude that invited reflection more than action. Thomas had noticed that Luke, though still full of questions and curiosity, had become more thoughtful in the days since their visit to the restaurant. He wasn't quieter in the way that suggested something was wrong. Rather, he seemed to be paying more attention, as if the world had opened up to him in a different way, and he was learning how to see it properly for the first time. Thomas didn't press him. Instead, he let the days unfold, watching as Luke spent long stretches of time at the kitchen table, sketching or writing, brow furrowed in concentration. When Thomas asked what he was working on, Luke simply said, "Something important," and continued. That was enough for Thomas. He had learned, especially in the last week, that the best lessons didn't come from lectures. They came from experience, from allowing children the space to grow into understanding rather than forcing it upon them. On Sunday morning, Luke came downstairs clutching a folded piece of paper. He held it carefully as if it was something fragile. He approached his father and offered it without a word. Thomas, sipping his coffee, accepted it and opened the note slowly. Inside was a letter written in Luke's uneven but determined handwriting. It began simply, "Dear Emily, I'm sorry I made you scared. I didn't mean to be mean. I just saw your picture, and I thought the girl looked really happy. I drew her from memory and put it in a frame because I thought it might help. I didn't know the picture was so important. I do now. My dad says sometimes small things are the most important things. I think Lucy was that kind of important. I hope you are okay. I hope you remember her the way you want to. I hope you like the drawing. I'm really sorry. Luke." Thomas read the letter twice, then looked up at his son, who was staring at the floor, shuffling his feet. "Did you want to give this to her?" Thomas asked. Luke nodded. "In person, if that's okay." Thomas reached out and placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. "I think it's more than okay." They arrived at the restaurant just after the lunch rush on Monday. Thomas had called ahead and asked if Emily might have a few minutes to speak with them privately. The manager had agreed, and now Emily waited for them in the back garden area. where a few tables had been set up for outdoor dining under a canopy of ivy-covered lattice. She stood as they approached, her expression unreadable. Luke stepped forward without hesitation and offered her the folded letter. Emily took it gently, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the page and began to read. Her eyes scanned the lines slowly, and Thomas could see the way her face changed. First surprise, then a deep, painful warmth, like something fragile unfolding in her chest. When she finished, she looked at Luke. "You remembered her name?" Luke nodded. "Lucy." Emily's voice cracked when she spoke again. "Thank you for this." "I didn't know it would hurt you," Luke said. "But I know now, and I want to help. My dad says, helping doesn't have to be big, just true." Emily knelt so she was eye level with him. "That's very wise of you and very kind." Luke didn't answer, just gave a small, serious nod. Emily folded the letter and placed it in the breast pocket of her apron. "I'll keep this forever," she said. Thomas, watching the exchange, felt something loosen in his chest. He had never been more proud of his son than in that moment, not for writing the letter, not for the drawing, but for showing up, for choosing to face the discomfort he had caused and try to make it right. That kind of courage couldn't be taught. It had to be lived. Before they left, Emily asked if she could give Luke something in return. She disappeared into the back and returned with a small clear plastic charm. Inside it was a pressed yellow flower. "She gave it to me once," Emily said softly. "Said it looked like sunshine. I used to carry it in my wallet, but I think maybe it should go to you now." Luke looked at Thomas, then back at Emily. "Are you sure?" She smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since they had met. "I think Lucy would have liked that." Luke accepted the charm with both hands, holding it like treasure. Thomas could see the way his fingers closed around it, gently, reverently. They left the restaurant not long after, the sky overhead, now clear and wide. Thomas and Luke walked in silence for a while before Luke spoke again. "Do you think I helped her feel better?" Thomas looked down at him. "I think you helped her feel seen, and sometimes that's the beginning of everything." Back at home, Luke placed the charm on his bedside table. He didn't ask questions that night. He didn't talk about cartoons or school or superheroes. He just sat on the edge of his bed, looking at the charm, occasionally glancing out the window at the stars. Meanwhile, Emily returned to work with the letter folded and tucked safely in her pocket. Throughout the day, she found herself touching it absent-mindedly, fingers brushing against the paper like it was something alive. And in a way, it was. It was a gesture that reminded her the world hadn't moved on without her, that even in her grief there were still people, strangers even, capable of kindness deep enough to change the shape of a day, maybe even a life. That night, Emily sat at her kitchen table and began to write again. Not letters, not essays, just thoughts, hopes, possibilities. She wrote about Lucy, about memory, about pain and healing. She didn't know what she would do with the pages yet, but for the first time in years she wanted to write them. And somewhere else in the city, Thomas sat at his desk, reviewing a list of upcoming events for the foundation. He paused, pulled out a separate sheet, and began drafting a new role, a new position that didn't exist yet. One that would be shaped not by degrees or resumes, but by resilience. A role for someone who had learned in the hardest way possible what it meant to keep going when everything else had stopped. He didn't know yet if Emily would say yes, but he knew he had to make space for her if she did, because something had shifted. Not just in her, not just in Luke, but in him as well. And once something inside you shifts like that, you don't go back. You build forward. The morning air in Charleston was thick with the scent of magnolia and salt, clinging to the brick-lined streets as Emily walked slowly toward the waterfront. The sun had just begun to climb, casting soft streaks of light across the quiet city. It was the kind of morning that seemed suspended in time, the kind that asked for silence and offered space to think. Emily needed both. In her hands, she held a copy of the letter Luke had written, folded neatly and tucked into her worn notebook. She had read it every night since he'd given it to her, and each time it stirred something slightly different in her: sorrow, gratitude, hesitation, and something newer, more dangerous, hope. Not the loud, defiant kind, but the quiet type that whispered maybe into the empty spaces she had tried so hard to ignore. Thomas's offer still weighed heavily on her. The idea of stepping into a foundation that worked with grief and trauma didn't frighten her because it was unfamiliar. It frightened her because it wasn't. It was too familiar, too close to the raw edges she still carried inside. She had built her survival on keeping those edges hidden, smoothed out behind a practiced smile and the repetition of daily routines. To work with others who had lost so much would mean breaking that silence. It would mean facing everything she had been trying so hard to outrun. Still, she had agreed to meet Thomas again. They sat across from each other at a small table in the Foundation's Riverside office. This time, there were no speeches, no offers laid out in professional terms, just a pot of coffee between them and the soft hum of the city beyond the glass. "I haven't made a decision yet," Emily said after a long pause. "You don't have to," Thomas replied. "This isn't a deadline, it's an invitation." Emily looked out at the river, where a pair of ducks drifted past, unconcerned with the weight of human lives. "I'm not sure I'm the kind of person people come to for help." "I disagree," Thomas said quietly. "You've already helped more than you realize." She didn't respond immediately. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with one finger, her thoughts far away. "Do you know what it's like?" she asked suddenly. "To wake up and forget just for a second that someone you love is gone? That 1 second before reality catches up and crushes you all over again." Thomas nodded once, slow and solemn. "Every morning after my wife passed, it never stopped hurting, but I learned how to live with it." Emily met his eyes. "How?" "I started building something that meant she wasn't really gone, something that carried her spirit forward." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Emily leaned back in her chair. "If I do this, it has to be on my terms. I won't pretend to be healed. I won't lie to the people I work with. I won't sit in meetings and nod politely if I don't believe what we're doing helps someone." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Good. I don't want someone who's mastered pretending. I want someone who remembers what it feels like to break." She stared at him, searching for any sign of performance in his expression, any shadow of condescension. She found none. Just a man who had seen loss, lived through it, and built something from the wreckage. Emily stood abruptly. "I need time, but I think I want to try." Thomas stood as well, extending a hand. "That's all I ask." They shook once, briefly, firmly, and then Emily turned and walked out into the morning light. Over the next few days, the wheels of change began to turn. Thomas brought Emily's name into the next board meeting. He spoke not of her resume, she didn't have one prepared, but of her presence, of what she had endured, of what she had to offer. There was hesitation at first. Some wanted structure, assurances, clear roles and guidelines, but Thomas had built his name and fortune on instinct, and he knew when something mattered. "She doesn't need a job description," he told them. "She needs a platform, and we need her more than she needs us." The board agreed. Meanwhile, Emily returned to work at Hattie's table, but something had changed. Her steps were more certain, her smile less forced. Customers noticed. Her co-workers did too. One afternoon during a lull in service, her manager approached her. "You're different," he said. "Brighter, maybe." Emily shrugged. "I'm trying." He nodded and handed her a note. "Someone dropped this off for you." Inside was a drawing. Another one. A simple sketch of a girl in a yellow dress standing beside a boy with messy hair, both of them smiling under a tree. At the bottom it read, "For Emily from Luke." She laughed softly, clutching the paper to her chest. It felt like a second invitation. That night, she cleared a space on the shelf above her bed. She placed the new drawing beside the framed copy of the first one Luke had given her and the pressed yellow flower he had accepted in return. It looked almost like an altar, not to grief, but to continuity, to what was lost and what remained. 2 weeks later, Emily walked into the foundation for her first day. She was nervous, terrified even. But she carried with her the letter, the drawings, and the fragile belief that her pain might be of use to someone else. Thomas met her in the front lobby, holding a small folder. "No forms today," he said. "No formalities. Just come meet the team." Emily followed him through the halls of the building, past rooms filled with counselors and coordinators, and families trying to find their footing again. Each face she passed reminded her why she said yes. Not because she had the answers, but because she understood the questions. And sometimes that was enough. Luke, when he heard the news, drew one more picture. This time, it was of a woman standing in front of a group of people, a golden light behind her, her hand raised as if guiding them forward. At the top he wrote, "Hope looks like this." Thomas hung it in his office the same day. The first few days at the foundation were quiet for Emily, but not in a peaceful way. She sat through orientation meetings, met with coordinators and counselors, and was shown around the various departments. Everyone was kind, polite, and clearly briefed on who she was. No one asked her about her background. No one mentioned Lucy. It was a courtesy, she knew, but it made her feel like she was floating through someone else's story, as if she had stepped into a life she wasn't sure she had earned. The office space she was given was small but warm. A window overlooked the river, and the desk was clean, uncluttered. A few hours into her first official week, a member of the Foundation's support team dropped off a welcome packet. It included forms, a handbook, and a letter signed by Thomas. That said, "You belong here." She read the letter 3 times. She didn't feel like she belonged. Not yet. She attended a team session later that afternoon. The topic was narrative recovery, helping families reconstruct their lives through storytelling. The coordinator, leading the session, a soft-spoken woman named Michelle, invited attendees to share how their own narratives had changed after loss. Several people offered deeply personal insights, sharing stories of children, parents, siblings lost to illness or accidents or violence. The honesty in the room was overwhelming. When Michelle looked at Emily and asked gently, "Would you like to share?" The room fell silent. Emily froze. It wasn't fear of speaking, it was fear of unraveling. She had stitched herself together so carefully over the past 2 years. If she started talking about Lucy now, if she let even one word escape, the protective wall she had built, she wasn't sure how she would stop. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was defense. "Not today," she said quietly. Michelle smiled and nodded, moving on. But Emily felt every eye in the room shift away from her, and with it came the prickling heat of self-consciousness. She didn't blame them. In a place built on shared experience and vulnerability, her refusal to speak felt like a betrayal. That night, she returned home more exhausted than she'd been after a double shift at the restaurant. The silence of her apartment, once comforting, now felt accusing. She sat on the couch, pulled the framed drawing Luke had given her into her lap and stared at it for a long time. Was she making a mistake? She picked up her phone, stared at Thomas's number in her contacts, and debated calling him. Not to quit, not yet, but to ask why he had chosen her, why he thought she could do this, but she didn't call. She placed the phone face down on the couch and instead opened her laptop. She began typing, not a message, not a resignation, but a journal entry. "Today I sat in a room with people who understand the kind of silence I've lived in. I couldn't speak. I watched others do what I couldn't. I don't know if I'm strong enough to stay, but I want to be, that's something." Over the next few days, Emily kept showing up. She did small things, helped sort letters from families, sat in on calls with support coordinators, shadowed Michelle during intake interviews. She learned the rhythm of the place, the way some people smiled through pain, while others sat in numb silence, desperate for someone to hear what they couldn't say out loud. She spoke only when necessary, often choosing to listen instead. And that, unexpectedly, made a difference. Clients opened up to her in the waiting room, sharing fragments of their grief, simply because she listened without rushing them, without offering empty reassurances. She wasn't trying to fix them, she was just there. One afternoon, as she was returning from lunch, she found Thomas waiting near her desk. He was holding a folder and wearing the expression of someone who'd come to ask a favor. "There's a group starting next week," he said. "It's for mothers who've lost children. We've struggled to find someone who understands them on more than just a professional level." Emily's posture stiffened. Thomas saw it. He didn't push. You wouldn't be leading the group, just sitting in, listening, maybe sharing if you feel ready. She looked at the folder in his hand but didn't reach for it. You said you wanted to do this on your terms, Thomas continued. So this is me respecting that. Say no if you want. Say nothing, I'll understand. Emily said nothing. She took the folder, nodded once and walked past him into her office. That night she didn't sleep. She lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, the folder still unopened beside her. Her mind spun with images she had tried to bury. Hospital corridors, the sound of rain on the windshield. The moment she realized Lucy wasn't going to wake up. She clutched the edge of the blanket tighter. By morning, she still hadn't opened the folder, but she took it with her to work anyway. At the end of the day, after everyone had gone home, she sat alone at her desk and finally lifted the cover. Inside were the names of the women in the group, short summaries of their stories. One had lost a toddler to pneumonia, another had lost a teenager in a school shooting, another twins in a car accident. Emily read every word, and for the first time, instead of closing the folder, she pulled out a notepad and began to write. She didn't know if she would speak. She didn't know if she could, but she wrote their names down again, slowly, one by one. She wanted to remember them, because deep down, despite the fear, despite the resistance, despite the ache that came, every time she saw Lucy's name in her mind, she knew something had changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was standing at the edge of something else, something terrifying and beautiful. She was considering the possibility of letting go of silence. By the following week, the folder was no longer just a file of names to Emily. It was a map. Not a map in the literal sense, but a chart of something deeply human and fragile, drawn from pain. She had read through the women's profiles more times than she could count, their stories quietly etched into her thoughts. Each one felt like a mirror turned slightly at an angle, reflecting parts of her life back at her in subtle, unnerving ways. They weren't the same stories. Each loss was unique, each grief carried in different ways. But there was a thread running through them, all that Emily couldn't ignore. A shared absence, a shared fight to stay above water in a world that no longer made sense. On the morning of the support group's first meeting, she stood outside the Foundation's small conference room for nearly 10 minutes before she found the courage to step inside. She wasn't expected to speak. She wasn't even expected to stay. But Thomas had made it clear that this moment, like everything else in her new role, would be hers to shape. No scripts, no expectations. Inside, the room was set up simply. A circle of chairs, soft lighting, and a tray of tea and coffee on a side table. The women arrived one by one, greeting each other with polite nods and hushed words. Some looked nervous, others carried the posture of long familiar grief, and one or two seemed hollowed out by a pain too deep for language. Emily took a seat off to the side, away from the circle, notebook in her lap. She didn't speak. She listened. The facilitator, a social worker named Carol, began the session with gentle introductions. No one had to share if they didn't want. This was about creating space. As the women began to speak, their stories came in waves, some hesitant, others tumbling out as if the silence had become unbearable. A mother described the last lunch she made for her daughter. Another spoke of the way people stopped saying her child's name, as if erasing him from conversation would erase the memory of his death. Emily listened, each word settling like stone inside her. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no tears. That brought relief. Just the slow, painful honesty of people trying to breathe through a wound that never healed. At the end of the session, Carol thanked everyone and reminded them they were welcome back next week. The women began to gather their things, some hugging softly, others simply nodding before leaving. Emily remained seated, her notebook still closed. Carol walked over. "You okay?" Emily nodded. "I'm not sure what I'm doing yet, but I want to come back." "You're doing fine," Carol said. "Being here matters more than you think." Emily returned to her desk that afternoon changed. Not outwardly. No one would have guessed anything was different. But something had shifted inside her, like a quiet decision being made. She didn't rush into her next steps. She didn't suddenly find her voice in front of a crowd. But she knew now that she had a place here. Not just as someone working in a foundation, but as someone who had lived the story most people were afraid to tell. In the following weeks, Emily continued to attend the sessions. Each time she moved her chair a little closer to the circle. She began speaking in fragments, then in full sentences. She didn't tell her whole story at once. She didn't need to. Just sharing that she had lost a daughter and that she still carried that grief every day was enough to unlock connection. The women didn't judge her for being quiet. They understood. Outside of the group, Emily's presence in the foundation began to take shape. She started developing resources for parents who struggled to talk about loss with surviving children. She helped design workshops focused on healing through creativity, art, writing, storytelling. Her suggestions weren't from a textbook. They came from experience, from nights spent tracing the outline of a photo that no longer had a voice attached to it. The foundation team began to lean on her, not just for insight, but for something harder to define: authenticity. Emily didn't offer quick solutions. She offered time, presence, and a kind of trust that can only be earned by someone who has sat in the same darkness. Thomas watched this evolution quietly, never interfering. When they passed each other in the hall, he would offer a respectful nod, sometimes a brief exchange, but never overstepping the boundary she had set. He knew better than to treat her journey like a project. She wasn't here to be saved. She was here to build something no one else could. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult group session, in which one of the mothers had broken down entirely, unable to speak through her sobs, Emily stayed behind to help tidy the room. Carol had left to speak privately with the woman, and Emily found herself alone. She looked around the room at the empty chairs, the half-finished mugs of tea, the crumpled tissues. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was full, real. She walked over to the whiteboard in the corner of the room and wrote a single sentence: "You're not alone. We remember with you." Then she left the room, heart steady, breath calm. The next morning, she arrived early. She walked into Thomas's office and sat down across from him, without waiting to be invited. He looked up, surprised but not unwelcoming. "I'm staying," she said. He nodded. "I'm glad. But I want to do more than just observe. I want to lead something. I want to take what I've been through and turn it into something that helps other people climb out of that silence." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Then tell me what you need." Emily smiled. Not the brittle smile of someone trying to survive, but the grounded one of someone beginning to live again. "I'll send you a proposal," she said. That evening, as the sun set over the river, Emily walked along the foundation's path with a sense of direction she hadn't felt in years. She didn't have all the answers. The grief hadn't disappeared, but it had become something else, less like a weight and more like a foundation, something she could build on. And in that moment, she wasn't defined by what she had lost, but by what she was choosing to do with it. As spring stretched into early summer, the days in Charleston grew longer and warmer, the air thick with jasmine and the sounds of children returning to parks and playgrounds. School was winding down, and with each passing day, Luke Whitaker seemed to move with a purpose that hadn't been there before. Thomas noticed the change slowly, at first through subtle shifts: Luke's increased focus during homework time, the thoughtful pauses before speaking, the way he started asking deeper questions, not just about facts or history, but about people and feelings. One morning, Thomas found Luke sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of colored paper, glue sticks, and markers spread around him like a small workshop. The boy was carefully cutting out shapes, glancing at a rough sketch he had taped to the wall. "What are you working on?" Thomas asked, setting down his coffee. "A memory box," Luke said without looking up, "for kids at the foundation." Thomas sat across from him, intrigued. "Tell me more." Luke lifted a small cardboard box he had already covered in soft fabric. Inside were paper hearts, stars, and handwritten notes with simple messages. "You're not forgotten." She mattered. "It's okay to cry." "I thought," Luke said, choosing his words carefully, "that maybe if they had something to hold, it would help them remember in a good way, not just a sad one." Thomas didn't answer right away. He felt his throat tighten. "That's a beautiful idea." Luke gave a small shrug, brushing glue from his fingers. Emily said remembering is part of healing. From that moment on, Thomas began to see Luke's transformation not as a phase, but as a real unfolding. He started asking if he could visit the foundation more often. What began as casual visits turned into weekly routines. Every Friday afternoon, Thomas would take him after school, and Luke would help the office staff with small tasks, organizing art supplies, delivering water to meeting rooms, arranging chairs for group sessions. The adults treated him with a mixture of admiration and affection. He didn't speak much during sessions, but his presence was grounding. Some of the grieving children clung to his quiet confidence, following him with cautious eyes, as if trying to understand what made this boy so calm. One day, a little girl named Jasmine, who had lost her brother in a house fire, asked Luke why he kept coming. He thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because I saw someone hurting and I made it worse, but then I learned I could make it better too." It wasn't rehearsed. It was just truth. Emily, who had been nearby, turned away so no one would see her wiping her eyes. Luke's school noticed the change too. His teachers sent notes home about his improved focus, his willingness to help classmates, his questions that now leaned toward understanding motivations rather than just right answers. One teacher remarked, "Luke doesn't just learn anymore, he listens, and that's a different kind of intelligence." One Saturday, the foundation hosted an open house for families, donors, and staff. There were booths showcasing the programs, artwork from group sessions, and a wall of framed letters written by survivors. Emily was stationed near the center, answering questions and guiding guests through the exhibit on loss and resilience. She wore a simple necklace, a small gold butterfly charm that Luke had given her, which he had saved for weeks to buy with his allowance. Thomas watched from across the room as Luke helped a group of kids decorate small candles. He wasn't doing it for praise. He didn't look over for approval. He was simply present, engaged, connected. Later that afternoon, Thomas pulled Emily aside. "You've given him something I couldn't," he said quietly. "I tried to teach him empathy, but you helped him feel it." Emily shook her head. "He already had it. He just needed a place to show it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Luke lead a small circle of children through a storytelling game. His voice was calm, his words simple, but the way the children leaned in told the real story. "He's going to carry this with him forever," Emily said. "Not just the pain, the growth." That night, back at home, Thomas tucked Luke into bed. It was one of those rare quiet moments when the noise of the day had faded and the city hummed softly outside their windows. "Do you remember when we went to the restaurant?" Thomas asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Luke nodded. "I was scared. I was angry," Thomas said, "but I'm glad it happened. Not the way it started, but what it became." Luke turned over onto his side, his voice muffled in the pillow. "Me too." Thomas reached for the small nightlight Luke now kept on his bedside table. It wasn't shaped like a superhero or an animal, but a butterfly, just like Lucy's. Charm. Luke had chosen it without explanation. "You helped someone find their voice," Thomas said, "and that's not something most people your age can say." Luke's breathing slowed, drifting towards sleep. Thomas sat there a moment longer, the quiet wrapping around them like a soft blanket. He realized, with a clarity that only came in stillness, that his son was becoming the kind of person he himself had always wanted to be. Not because of wealth or power, but because of the way Luke now moved through the world, with compassion, with awareness, and with a quiet strength that came not from avoiding pain, but from confronting it. And Thomas knew then, as deeply as he had ever known anything, that what had happened in that restaurant had not been a disruption. It had been the beginning of everything. The Foundation's calendar was marked with many significant dates, but one in particular held a weight, unlike the others. It was the day designated to honor children lost too soon, a quiet, dignified gathering of families who carried grief in their daily lives and had found, within the Foundation, a place where they could speak their children's names out loud without fear of discomfort or silence. For Emily, the day held a new kind of meaning this year. It would be the first time she wasn't just a guest or participant in mourning. She was part of the organization itself now, part of the team responsible for giving these memories the space and reverence they deserved. In the weeks leading up to the event, Emily immersed herself in its preparation. She reviewed every detail of the program: the speakers, the candlelight ceremony, the art displays created by children who had lost siblings. She ensured that the messages woven through the day were real, unpolished, and rooted in compassion, rather than forced optimism. There would be no slogans about moving on. There would be acknowledgement of pain, celebration of memory, and above all, a shared breath between people who had walked similar paths. Thomas, too, took a quiet but active role. He trusted Emily's vision and knew better than to overshadow her leadership. What had started as a hesitant offer of employment had evolved into one of the most impactful partnerships he had ever witnessed. She was no longer someone he had helped. She was someone who had transformed the very spirit of the foundation. The day of the tribute arrived on a warm Saturday in early June. The sky was cloudless, the air filled with the scent of blooming gardenias from the nearby park. Families gathered under a large white tent erected near the river's edge, where a light breeze stirred the edges of the canvas. Rows of white chairs faced a simple stage, and on each seat rested a small folded program and a candle in a glass holder. Emily stood near the back of the tent as guests arrived, quietly observing. She had chosen not to speak that day, opting instead to let others carry the microphone: parents, siblings, counselors. Her job was in the silence between words, the comforting nod, the presence that needed no announcement. As the ceremony began, Thomas stepped up to the podium to deliver the foundation's welcome. His voice was calm and sure, but tinged with the emotion he no longer felt the need to hide. He spoke of loss not as an end, but as a thread that continued through every act of remembrance, through every hand held, through every moment like this one. He paused, then looked out at the crowd. "There's someone I want to recognize today," he said. "Someone who changed the course of this foundation with one moment of truth, one act of courage, and a heart that refused to shut down despite unspeakable pain." The audience shifted slightly. Emily froze. "This person reminded us all," Thomas continued, "that healing doesn't always come from a place of distance or professionalism. Sometimes it comes from a mother sitting across the table, speaking, not with expertise but with lived understanding. Sometimes it comes from someone brave enough to say, 'I'm not okay, but I'm here.'" He looked directly at Emily. "Today, I am proud to announce that Emily Carrington will be the new Director of Community Outreach and Support Programs. Not because she asked for it, not because she needed a title, but because she has become the heart of what we do." A hush fell over the crowd. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The sound wasn't loud or thunderous. It was gentle, rising, in waves, filled with recognition and gratitude. Emily stood still for a moment, caught in the soft light filtering through the tent, her hand resting near the butterfly pendant on her necklace. Then she stepped forward, not to the stage but just enough to be seen. She nodded once, a quiet thank you, eyes shimmering with tears she didn't try to hide. After the applause settled, the ceremony continued. Families lit candles as names were read aloud, the soft glow of hundreds of tiny flames dancing beneath the canvas ceiling. When Lucy's name was spoken, Emily held her candle with both hands, letting her tears fall freely, surrounded by people who understood. There was no need to explain anything. The warmth of shared memory was enough. After the ceremony, people approached her with quiet words, gentle hands, and tearful smiles. Some thanked her for what she had built. Others told her about their own children. One woman, holding a photograph of a boy in a baseball uniform, simply said, "You gave me the courage to say his name out loud again." Luke had been there too, seated between Thomas and one of the foundation's counselors. He had helped organize the candles, passed out programs, and guided children to the craft station where they could make paper lanterns. When the ceremony ended, he walked up to Emily with a small envelope in his hand. "I made you something," he said. She opened it slowly and found another drawing. It was Lucy again, this time older than in the photograph, perhaps the age she would have been now. She was standing in a garden, surrounded by butterflies and stars. Above her head were the words, She's still shining. Emily looked at Luke, her voice catching. You've grown so much. Luke gave a small smile. So have you. That night, when Emily returned home, she didn't place the new drawing on the shelf with the others. Instead, she framed it and hung it by the door, where she would see it every time she left or returned. It felt right. A daily reminder that Lucy wasn't just part of her past, she was part of everything she was becoming. Thomas, standing alone in his office as the city lights blinked to life across the river, thought about the journey that had brought them all here. A misunderstanding, a moment of pain, a single photograph, how quickly life could shift, how deeply people could change, and how sometimes the smallest acts, a child's drawing, a mother's truth, a stranger's apology, could open a door. None of them knew they were waiting to walk through. He looked down at a piece of paper on his desk, one of Luke's earliest drawings, the girl in the yellow dress, arms wide, eyes full of joy. Below it, written in crayon, "Hope looks like this." He smiled, because it did.